Welcome back. We're discussing a new study by a panel of international law experts who found that human rights have often gone ignored by Western democracies in the post-9/11 era. I'm joined by Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who participated in the 3-year study that revealed the so-called war on terror has eroded respect for international law. As we get back to our discussion, Mrs. Robinson, let me just touch on the issue of what's happening in the United Kingdom. Just a few hours before we conduct this interview, the former head of MI5 there, the intelligence agency, Dame Stella Rimington, said that, has sort of pointed out that she felt the handling of the war on terror was perhaps not up to scratch, and said that since I've retired, I feel more at liberty to be against certain decisions of the government, especially the attempt to pass laws which interfere with the people's privacy. And I wonder what sort of reaction there has been in Britain to the fact that someone at the top of the security services can be so candid about this.
Certainly what she said has been widely reported, and in a way I feel that this makes the timing of our report quite good. Not just that there is a new administration in the United States, but that there are senior figures, some of them retired figures, retired judges like Lord Bingham and others, who are pointing to the fact that the practices in the United Kingdom have gone very far indeed. The period of pre-trial detention of 28 days, the attempt to extend that to 42 days, which fortunately failed, and other worrying concerns. And I must say, we've been talking to some officials here in London, and they have certainly been receptive to the ideas in our report. And standards matter. One of the most important of those standards is the Geneva Conventions. And I listened to the clip from former Vice President Cheney, and he is not right in what he says, and it has to be countered. The Geneva Conventions apply in situations of armed conflict. And therefore, those who were put in Guantanamo Bay, who had been in either Afghanistan or in Iraq, were entitled to an individual assessment by an impartial body under the Geneva Convention as to whether they were entitled to the Geneva Convention. It was not for Vice President Cheney to make that determination, or the administration. And that was one of the very blatant contraventions of the Geneva Conventions. And that was part of this paradigm of a so-called war on terrorism, where they made up new rules where human rights no longer applied. What he called at one stage the new normal, which was a horrible way of describing a situation where the Bush administration was not adhering to legal standards which the United States had undertaken to comply with under the Convention Against Torture and under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I had to make those points when I was High Commissioner, and as you said, I wasn't very popular in making them, but this report shows that 7 years on, this has become very, very worrying. Right.
Well, vindicated to some degree there. And there's an email that came in from a regular viewer, Paula Varley in Norfolk in the UK, who actually wrote a very comprehensive email. I'm just going to take an excerpt here on the issue, one of the issues you're touching on here. It says, how could the UN force nations like the US and UK to repeal laws which are already in violation of those countries' international treaty obligations? Legal challenge in domestic courts may be the best strategy to force the repeal of these laws.
Yes, that is part of what we're looking at is how do we go forward now? The title is Assessing Damage, Urging Action, and that's what that question is directed to. What do we do? I have to emphasize that, yes, we did look at the United States and the United Kingdom, but we looked at some 40 countries in the 16 hearings. Some of them were regional for East Africa. We had hearings in Asia. We had hearings in various countries, Canada, Australia, etc., and countries like Pakistan. And so it's not fair to just focus entirely on the US and UK, but we did hear in hearings when we challenged the broadening of security laws in the Russian Federation, etc. Well, the practice has changed. Look at the United States or look at the United Kingdom. So there was that knock-on effect. But to the question, yesterday in Geneva, we had a very good discussion with the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, originally from South Africa, and the chair of the Human Rights Council. And we pointed out the Human Rights Council now has universal periodic review. But we looked at the review that had taken place of countries with very bad records of abusing their security law in this area, of torture, of disappearances. And we didn't find that was coming through in the review. So we were saying you must strengthen that system. We want the Security Council with its counter-terrorism committee, which is supposed to be monitoring what countries do in their counter-terrorism practices, not just to see whether they are effective full stop, but to see do they comply with human rights. And so that's two ways of trying to urge action. We also want countries which have fallen below the standard to have inquiries. Senator Patrick Leahy has indicated that he wants an independent inquiry in the United States. We would welcome that.
Interesting. A lot of people worry about the accountability or lack of accountability that resulted from the so-called war on terror. And there was a lot of questioning of tactics that, for example, countries like the United States used in outsourcing their tasks to private security firms, perhaps to be less accountable themselves. Is there any issue there when it comes to how things might change in the future, the accountability factor, especially when it comes to, for example, private contractors?
I think that issue of private contractors is very important because for a very long period in Iraq, during the early part of the war there, those independent contractors appeared to be completely immune to have complete impunity. And that in itself is totally contrary to rule of law and protection of human rights. And of course it led to, I think, abuses and malpractices, as we've seen. But the first step, I think, in urging action is to urge countries where there are serious issues to be addressed to have independent inquiries, to actually have the courage and the consistency with human rights to say we need to really examine the situation and see how things went wrong, what the responsibility was, what the pressures were, and first of all how we then address that and put these right, but also about accountability and about the victims. There have been victims, as we know. I mean, the case of the Syrian, Canadian Syrian, who was arrested boarding a plane in Kennedy Airport on what was, in fact, faulty intelligence from Canada. We know now about that case, and we know it was faulty intelligence, and that what happened to him in being sent to Syria and being tortured there was totally wrong for that person, and he has been compensated by Canada. But as yet, the United States has not admitted that their complicity in all of that was highly, very wrong and should be admitted.
We had an interesting email from Sri Lanka from Amin Izzaddin in Colombo, who sent this a comment in saying, "The definition of counter-terrorism is as problematic as the definition of terrorism. I believe the burden of culpability is more on the state than on the non-state actors because the state is bound by laws and norms that make us call ourselves civilized." I wonder if with this retrospect on what's been happening over the past, say, 8 years or so, or certainly last 7 or 8 years since 9/11, whether we've reached a turning point where perhaps expressions such as the war on terror, the with us or against us, the axis of evil, these kind of phrases might be moved out, and perhaps a new approach to dealing with security could be taken.
That's what we very much hope. We feel that just as it happens, our report comes at a good time, precisely for the reasons that have just been sent into you in that email. That was a very thoughtful way of capturing. We don't actually have globally an agreed definition of terrorism, but we know what we're countering in acts of terrorism. There has not been enough scrutiny of the various measures of counter-terrorism, and we need some guidelines and I would say regulation of intelligence systems if there's going to be intelligence sharing, which is happening a lot now, and the standards of how that intelligence is acquired and to what purpose, how it is used. All of that needs to be looked at. And so we need leadership in the United Nations and at country level. But more than that, people, your listeners, can ask themselves, is the world really more secure for these measures, for the undermining of human rights? No, because it has also made people very cynical, especially, I think, in parts of the world where countries preach the gospel preach about human rights and freedom and democracy, but clearly have undermined fundamental aspects of rule of law and protection of human rights. So we need a sort of return to those fundamental standards.
Mrs. Robinson, thank you very much. We're out of time, but I thank you for joining us. Good luck with the report, though.
It's a pleasure, Riz.
Thank you. And thank you for being with us. On the next show, we speak with renowned Israeli author Amos Oz about the fear and frustration that was demonstrated by his country's recent elections and the decline of the Zionist left. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.